The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday night, Delia Fairchild had wept so hard her pillow was damp clear through to the feathers. She sat at the edge of her narrow bed in the back room of the Fairchild homestead, just outside Abilene, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, and she held that single page of paper like it was made of something sacred. The lamp on the bedside table threw a warm, trembling light across the words, and she read them again, for the fourth time that night, her lips moving silently over each sentence as though she needed to feel them in her mouth to believe they were real. She had not expected this. She had not expected any of it. She had answered his first letter on a dare. That was the honest truth of it, and she was too proud a woman to pretend otherwise. Her sister Rosalie had found the advertisement in the back pages of the Abilene Chronicle, one of those small print notices that the postmaster, Mr. Hankins, occasionally tacked to the board outside the general store, forwarded up from some other town's paper. Sought, a woman of good character and sound mind for correspondence and possible matrimony. Abel Barnett, rancher, Cutter's Creek, Montana Territory. Rosalie had read the notice aloud in a theatrical voice, batting her brown eyes and pressing her hand to her chest like a stage actress. She was 20 years old that autumn, 2 years younger than Delia, and she thought the whole notion of mail-order correspondence was the funniest, most scandalous thing she'd encountered since the preacher's horse had wandered into the saloon the previous spring. She had dared Delia to write. Just one letter, she'd said, just to see what sort of man would place such a notice. Probably some ancient, toothless rancher who smelled of cattle and couldn't string a sentence together. Delia had written the letter purely to prove she was not afraid of anything. That was her nature. She had been breaking horses since she was 16 years old. She could track a wounded deer through a pine forest in half the time it took her father's ranch hands to even lace their boots. She could read a horse's temperament in the first 3 seconds of approaching it, and she had a reputation across 3 counties as the finest equine trainer in the region, a reputation that made men uncomfortable and women quietly envious. She was not afraid of a letter, so she had written it. She had been deliberately blunt, almost challenging in her phrasing. She told him she was 22 years old. She told him she was a horse trainer, not a housewife. She told him she had no interest in being managed or instructed in things she already knew. She told him she could outcook most women she'd met but chose not to because there were more interesting things to do with a morning. She told him that if he was looking for a meek woman who would smile and nod and keep her opinions beneath her apron, he should save his postage. Then she sealed it, walked to the post office and forgot about it entirely. Or she tried to. 3 weeks passed. Then a letter arrived at the Fairchild homestead, addressed to Miss Delia Fairchild in a hand so clean and deliberate that it looked almost architectural. Rosalie had been the one to bring it to her, eyes wide with delighted horror, pressing it into Delia's hands as though it might detonate. Delia had opened it in the privacy of her room, expecting something dull and slightly defensive, the words of a man who had taken offense at her bluntness, or worse, hadn't noticed it at all. What she found instead was Abel Barnett. His letter began, "Miss Fairchild, you are either the most honest woman I have encountered in all my years of correspondence, or you are testing me. Either way, you have my complete attention." He wrote that he was 30 years old, that he had built his ranch in Montana's Cutter's Creek Valley from a single 160-acre claim, and 11 head of cattle 5 years prior, and that it now encompassed over 800 acres and a herd of more than 200. He wrote this not with boasting but with a kind of quiet, matter-of-fact accounting, as though he was simply presenting the relevant facts. He said he had placed the advertisement not because he was desperate or lonely, though he was sometimes both, but because the kind of woman he might meet in Cutter's Creek had a particular way of sizing up a man's land before she looked at his face, and he had grown tired of it. He said that a woman who could train horses was a woman who understood patience, psychology, and the rare art of earning trust rather than demanding it. He said that sounded like exactly the sort of woman he'd been looking for, though he hadn't known how to name it until he read her letter. Then, at the bottom of the page, in that same careful architectural hand, he had written, "I would very much like to continue this correspondence if you are willing. I make no promises and no demands. Only conversation for now." Delia had read that letter twice. Then she'd set it on her desk and gone out to the stable and spent an hour with a young roan mare she was training, and she thought about it the whole time her hands moved through the horse's mane. She wrote back, and then he wrote back, and then she wrote back again. For 6 weeks, the letters traveled back and forth between Abilene, Kansas, and Cutter's Creek, Montana, and each one arrived faster than the last, as though both of them were increasingly reluctant to let the silence stretch too long. Abel wrote about his land with a love that was almost poetic, describing the way the mountains looked at first light, how the Cutter's Creek Valley smelled after a summer storm, the particular way his cattle moved in the early morning cold. He wrote about a horse he had called Brigadier, a big black stallion who had thrown 3 of his best hands, and whom he himself had only partially managed to settle. He wrote about the problem with a kind of frustrated admiration, saying the horse had more intelligence than most people he'd met, and that he suspected that was the problem rather than the solution. Delia had written back a full 2 pages about exactly why Brigadier was behaving the way he was, asking precise and specific questions about the horse's history, his response to particular stimuli, whether he pinned his ears before he threw or went still first. She had included in that letter a detailed approach she recommended, step by step, based on a technique she developed herself over years of working with difficult horses. She had not thought much of it. It was simply her knowledge. Abel's next letter was different from all the others. She could feel it the moment she picked it up. The paper was thicker, the envelope a little heavier, and when she opened it, she found not 1 page but 4. He told her that he had followed her approach exactly, step by step, over 5 days. He told her that on the 5th morning, Brigadier had accepted the saddle without a tremor. Then he had written the words that had kept her awake for 3 nights. He wrote, "Miss Fairchild, Delia, if you will allow it, I have worked with horses my entire life, and my father before me, and I have never in all my years encountered a mind that understood them the way yours does. You diagnosed the nature of that horse from 500 miles away and through the medium of correspondence, and you were precisely correct in every particular. I am not a man who is easily astonished. You have astonished me. I am sitting here in my kitchen in the early morning, reading your instructions for the 4th time, and I find I am doing so not because I need to reference them any longer but because they were written by you, and I have found that anything written by you is worth reading more than once." He had gone on, in the manner of a man who had opened a door he hadn't planned to open and found himself unable to close it again. He wrote about what it was like to work the ranch alone, to have built something solid and real with his own hands, and find that the accomplishment felt strangely incomplete without someone to share it with. Not someone to serve him. He was careful about that word, almost apologetic in the way he addressed it, as though he knew she'd bristle at it. He said he had been thinking, during those 5 days of working with Brigadier, that he was following the instructions of a woman he had never met, and that this had not felt strange to him, and that the absence of strangeness had itself felt like something important. He had ended the letter with a question that was the most terrifying thing Delia Fairchild had ever been asked, and she was a woman who had once stood down a cornered mountain lion with nothing but a fence rail. He had asked if she might consider coming to Montana, not as a mail order bride, not under any condition she hadn't agreed to freely. He had been very clear and very careful about that. He proposed that she come for a trial period, 1 month, to see if the correspondence translated into something real. He said he would pay her travel costs and arrange proper accommodation with a respectable widow named Mrs. Clara Holt, who kept a boarding house in town, so that Delia's reputation would not suffer. He said that if at the end of 30 days she hated the land or found him intolerable or simply wanted to return to Kansas, He would put her on the train himself and never say another word about it. And if she did not find him intolerable, and if the land felt like something it could, over time, become hers, then they could speak further. Delia had wept reading every word of it. She had wept because nobody had ever spoken to her like that. She had wept because the letter was not a trap or a manipulation or a hidden motive dressed up in pretty language. She had enough intelligence to recognize the difference, and she had spent enough of her life bracing against men who saw her capability as a challenge to overcome rather than a quality to admire. She had wept because she was afraid, and she was almost never afraid, and the fear felt like something alive and warm rather than cold and dangerous. She pressed her hands flat against the pages and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she went and found Rosalie. Her sister was in the kitchen rolling out biscuit dough, and she looked up when Delia appeared in the doorway with red eyes and the letter crumpled gently against her chest. Rosalie set down the rolling pin. Her playful expression fell away instantly, replaced by something softer and more serious. "Delia," she said, "what happened?" "He asked me to come to Montana," Delia said. Rosalie was quiet for a moment. And I think I'm going to go." Rosalie crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and wrapped her arms around her sister, and they stood like that for a while without speaking, and that was enough. The journey from Abilene to Cutter's Creek, Montana Territory, was not a simple undertaking in the autumn of 1878. The Union Pacific and its connecting lines had opened much of the West to rail travel, but the last portion of the trip required a stagecoach from the nearest rail terminus. A bone-jarring, 2-day ride through country that grew more dramatic and more wild with every passing mile. Delia had packed a single large trunk with her most practical clothing: riding skirts, sturdy boots, her good wool coat, and a smaller bag with the letters, all of them, tied with a length of twine that her fingers had worried loose and retied a dozen times during the journey. She read them again on the train. She had them memorized by now, but she read them anyway, the way you trace a familiar path with your finger on a map, not because you need the directions, but because the path itself is a comfort. She was nervous, and she did not like being nervous, and the combination made her more sharp-edged than usual, which made the stagecoach driver slightly afraid of her, which she felt a little guilty about. Cutter's Creek was a town of perhaps 400 souls at the northern end of a valley that ran between 2 ridges of the Rockies. She arrived on an October afternoon when the aspens had gone gold, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that seems too vivid to be natural, and the mountains in the distance were already wearing their first serious snowcaps. The air smelled of pine and cold water and wood smoke, and Delia stood in the street outside the stage office with her trunk at her feet and her bag in her hand and thought, oh, this is real. She had half expected him not to come. Some dark, protective corner of her mind had entertained the possibility that the whole thing was an elaborate misunderstanding, that the real Abel Barnett would be nothing like the man who had written those letters, that she would arrive and find a fiction. She heard him before she saw him. A voice behind her said, "Miss Fairchild," and it was the kind of voice that belonged to a man who was accustomed to speaking quietly and being heard regardless. She turned. Abel Barnett was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that stretched his flannel shirt to its seams, and a jaw that could have been cut from the same granite that made up the mountains behind him. He was not pretty in the way some men were pretty. He had the face of a man who had spent years working outdoors, weathered and strong-boned, with dark eyes that were set deep beneath heavy brows and a mouth that looked like it didn't smile often, but when it did it meant something. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it at the brim, and that small, nervous gesture was so at odds with the sheer physical impression of him that Delia felt something shift in her chest. "Mr. Barnett," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, careful eyes, and she let him look because she was looking too. Then he said, "You're more formidable than your letters suggested, and your letters were quite formidable." She almost smiled. "That's either a compliment or a warning." "Both," he said, and then he did smile, and she had been right, it meant something. He helped her with her trunk without making a production of it, loading it into the back of a wagon he'd driven into town, and he introduced her to Mrs. Clara Holt, who was waiting at the boarding house and who turned out to be a small, fierce woman of about 60 with sharp gray eyes and an uncompromising manner that Delia immediately respected. Mrs. Holt showed her the room clean, warm, with a good view of the street and a writing desk by the window, and said she served breakfast at 7 and supper at 6, and that she didn't hold with nonsense. Delia told her she didn't hold with it either, and Mrs. Holt looked at her with a new and appreciative attention. Abel came to collect her the following morning to show her the ranch. He arrived at 8 o'clock precisely in the same wagon, dressed in a heavy canvas coat and a battered hat, and he said very little on the drive out, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. The road climbed gradually out of town, and then leveled through a broad sweep of open grassland before dipping down into the valley proper. And when the Barnett ranch came into view, the main house, the long low barn, the outbuildings, all of it set against the backdrop of the creek and the mountains, Delia felt something she hadn't expected. She felt it could be hers. She kept that feeling very still inside herself, the way you keep a flame cupped in your hands against the wind, and she said nothing about it. She was a practical woman. One day was not enough to make a decision of that magnitude. Abel showed her the property with the same quiet, matter-of-fact manner he'd used in his letters, not performing for her, not selling. He simply showed her things as they were, named them plainly, and answered questions when she asked them. He had 12 ranch hands who worked the property through the grazing season, and a foreman named Cade Sullivan, a lean, weathered man in his 50s with a deeply skeptical expression that softened somewhat when he realized Delia knew what she was looking at. And then Abel brought her to the stable, and she met Brigadier. The black stallion was magnificent. He stood at 17 hands, his coat the deep, true black that carries blue in sunlight, his neck arched and his eyes bright and rolling with intelligence, and something that in a human face you would have called suspicion. When Abel opened the stall gate, the horse immediately pressed to the far corner, not in fear but in a studied, deliberate refusal. Delia stood just outside the stall and watched. Abel said, "He's better than he was. Your instructions made a real difference. But there's still something I can't quite reach in him." Delia didn't answer right away. She was watching the horse with her full attention, reading him the way she read every horse, the set of his ears, the tension in his hindquarters, the way he was breathing. She noted the exact angle at which he held his head away from them, the particular quality of alertness in his body, and she felt the shape of the problem click into place in her mind. She said, "He had a hard experience with a lead rope at some point early in his training, before you had him. He's not objecting to you, he's anticipating a specific feeling. Watch his right ear." Abel watched. As Delia took one slow, quiet step through the gate into the stall, Brigadier's right ear flicked back and held not both ears, just the right one, tilted backward toward where a rope would approach from. "There," Delia said softly. Someone yanked a lead on his right side hard enough to leave a memory. He braces for it every time a person approaches from that angle. She moved still slowly, toward the horse's left side instead, completely ignoring his right, and she made no move toward his head at all. She simply stood at his left shoulder and breathed, long and even, and waited. Brigadier held his ground for nearly 2 full minutes. Then, degree by degree, his right ear came forward. His neck lowered a fraction. His breathing changed. Delia raised her left hand and laid it against his neck very gently, and he stood for it. Abel Barnett, standing in the doorway of that stall with his arms crossed over his wide chest, felt something happen to his understanding of this woman that was nothing short of seismic. He had seen good horsemen. He had seen good horsewomen. He had never seen anything like this, not the speed of it, not the precision of the diagnosis, not the economy of the approach. She had been in the stall for less than 5 minutes. Brigadier was standing quiet as a Sunday morning. "My God," Abel said, very quietly. He hadn't meant to say it aloud. Delia turned her head and looked at him over her shoulder, and there was nothing boastful in her expression, just the simple, competent satisfaction of a craftsperson who has done what they know how to do. "He'll need consistent work from the left side for a few weeks," she said. "Give him a chance to learn that not every approach is the one that hurt him." Abel stared at her for a long moment, and something in his dark eyes shifted into a new and unguarded territory. He said, "I've been working with horses for 20 years. "I know," she said. "You said that in your third letter." He almost smiled. "I've never seen anyone do what you just did in that time." She patted Brigadier's neck once more, deliberately, and then moved back out of the stall at the same quiet pace. She latched the gate and turned to face Abel fully, and she said, "That's because most people try to fix the behavior. I fix the belief." Abel Barnett was not a man who was easily astonished. She had told him that in a letter, and she had not been wrong. And he stood there in the doorway of his stable on a cold October morning in Montana with the mountains behind him, and looked at Delia Fairchild. And he was completely, thoroughly, undeniably astonished. And that was the exact moment, though neither of them would have named it as such for some time yet, that he fell in love with her. The 30 days began. Delia settled into a rhythm at Mrs. Holt's boarding house and developed what she privately thought of as a working arrangement with the ranch. Abel had asked her carefully, respectfully, not presuming, if she would be willing to spend some time working with Brigadier and a handful of other horses on the property who had behavioral issues that his hands couldn't manage. He offered to pay her a proper rate for the work, and she had appreciated that. He hadn't offered charity or framed it as a favor. He treated it as the professional exchange it was. She came to the ranch most mornings. Abel had his own work to attend to. The business of running 800 acres and 200 head of cattle was not a small enterprise, especially heading into the Montana winter. But he arranged things so that a part of every day found them together. Sometimes it was just at the noon meal, eaten in the kitchen of the main house with Cade Sullivan, and whatever hands were in from the field. A communal, easy affair where the conversation ranged from cattle prices to the peculiarities of the coming winter. Sometimes it was a ride in the late afternoon, when the light went golden and long across the valley floor, and Abel showed her the full boundaries of his land and talked about the plans he had for it. He talked to her differently than he wrote, she discovered. The letters had been articulate and thoughtful, but in person there was a quality to him that the written word couldn't fully capture, a steadiness, a kind of physical presence that was not intimidating so much as it was settling, the way a big, well-rooted tree is settling to stand near in a wind. He listened with his entire attention, and he thought before he answered, and he never once in those first weeks said anything that made her feel small. She found this almost suspicious. She was waiting for the trap, the hidden motive beneath the courteous surface, the moment when the real man appeared and turned out to be like all the others she'd encountered, the ones who'd wanted her skills as a curiosity or her competence as a convenience, but couldn't quite accept it as something that belonged to her rather than to them. She was braced for betrayal, because she had learned to be. Abel surprised her instead by simply not being that man. He surprised her specifically on the 7th day, when one of his younger hands, a 19-year-old named Tom Prout who was decent with cattle but still learning everything else, had made a clumsy, dismissive remark about women who kept company with horses being unfit for proper company. He had said it to another hand, not to Delia directly, but in a small enough space that she'd heard it clearly. She had said nothing. She had simply continued working. Abel had heard it too. He'd walked over to Tom Prout with the particular unhurried quality of a man who doesn't need speed to make a point, and he'd said, very quietly, that Miss Fairchild had more skill in one hand than Tom Prout would accumulate in his entire career, and that if Tom had a problem with the company she kept, he was welcome to seek employment at any of the other ranches in the valley, most of which were currently short-handed, and would be happy to take him. Tom had gone very red and very silent, and had found an urgent reason to be elsewhere. Delia had not thanked Abel for this because she hadn't needed rescuing. She had her own ways of handling small-minded remarks, but she had noticed it, and she had noted specifically that Abel had not made a speech or a display of it. He had simply corrected something that was wrong, in the same tone he'd used to correct a fence post that was leaning the wrong direction. It was a matter of basic accuracy to him, not a performance of chivalry. She thought about that for a long time. The letters continued even while she was in Cutter's Creek, because they were, she discovered, how both of them processed things. He would slide a folded note under Mrs. Holt's door in the early morning, nothing as elaborate as the long letters they'd exchanged across the distance. Just a few lines about something he'd thought of in the night or a question he'd forgotten to ask during the day. She wrote back in kind, and sometimes they exchanged 3 or 4 such notes in a single day without ever referencing them aloud, as though the correspondence was a separate and parallel conversation that existed alongside the spoken one. Mrs. Clara Holt watched all of this with the alert attention of a woman who had seen a great deal of human nature in her 60-odd years, and had developed reliable opinions about most of it. She said to Delia one evening over supper, just the two of them since the other boarder, a traveling seed merchant, had gone home to Bozeman that week, she said, "That man has been alone a long time." "I know," Delia said. "Not for want of options," Mrs. Holt said. "There have been women interested. He's a prosperous man and he's not hard to look at, but he's particular." "What is he particular about?" Mrs. Holt considered this, turning her teacup in her hands. "He doesn't want someone who wants the ranch," she said at last. "He wants someone who wants him, and he's smart enough to know the difference and stubborn enough to wait." Delia looked at her plate for a moment. "That's a dangerous combination," she said. "Yes," said Mrs. Holt. "So is yours." Delia looked up. "You want to be loved without being managed," Mrs. Holt said, "which is also a worthy thing to want. The question is whether you can believe it when you find it." The question sat with Delia for days. She worked with Brigadier every morning, and the horse's progress was remarkable. Within 2 weeks, he was accepting the saddle with equanimity and had begun to trust her completely, coming to her without hesitation when she entered the stable. The other horses she'd been working with were showing similar changes. Cade Sullivan, who had started the month with deep skepticism about her presence, had become a cautious but genuine admirer, and had told Abel within Delia's earshot, which she suspected was not accidental, that she had a gift that you didn't see more than once or twice in a lifetime. Abel had said simply, "I know." 2.5 weeks into the 30 days, they were riding the eastern boundary of the ranch in the late afternoon, the mountains going purple and orange in the failing light, when Abel's horse stumbled in a loose patch of rocky ground and came down hard on his right foreleg. The horse recovered his footing quickly and didn't go lame, but he was favoring the leg, and Abel dismounted immediately to check him. Delia was off her horse before Abel had finished his assessment, and she was at the horse's right foreleg 2 seconds later, running her hands down the cannon bone with practiced efficiency. She found the problem in moments: a slight swelling beginning just below the knee, a soft tissue strain but nothing broken, nothing that would cause lasting damage with proper care. "He needs cold water on that tonight and light stall rest for 3 days, she said. "No riding." Abel was crouched beside her, watching her hands on his horse's leg, and when she finished and stood, they were very closer than they'd been before. She could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the exact dark shade of his irises, the way the last light caught the edges of his jaw. She took a small, deliberate step back. He remained where he was and looked at her with an expression she'd come to recognize as his most honest one, the one he wore when he was not managing his own reaction, just feeling it. "You're going to leave in 10 days, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement that carried the weight of something he'd been carrying for a while. "I might," she said. "I don't want you to," she breathed out slowly. The wind moved through the dry grass around them, making a soft, continuous sound. "Abel, I'm not asking you to make a promise," he said with the same careful precision he brought to everything. "I'm just saying it plainly because I think you prefer plain. I want you to stay. He stopped and something moved across his face, a brief unguardedness. "I find that I've been writing you letters in my head for the past 3 weeks that I don't send because I'm afraid of misstepping, and that's a new experience for me." She stared at him. "You're afraid of misstepping with me?" "Considerably," he said, with an honesty so complete it was almost disarming. "You're afraid of very few things," she said. "I can tell that about you." "That's true," he agreed, "which is perhaps why this one is so notable." She looked at him for a long time, standing there in the fading light with his injured horse, miles from the ranch, in the cold that was coming down off the mountains with the evening. She thought about the letter that had made her weep. She thought about Mrs. Holt's question, whether she could believe it when she found it. She thought about the particular quality of a man who was afraid of her rejection, not because it would wound his pride but because it would cost him something he had decided he genuinely wanted. "I'm afraid too," she said. She had never said that to a man in her life. Something changed in his face, not relief exactly, more like a lock opening. "Then we're frightened together," he said. "That seems manageable." She laughed. She hadn't meant to, but it came out of her anyway, warm and unexpected. And she saw it do something immediate and visible to him, saw his whole face shift into the kind of warmth that he kept very carefully rationed. And she thought that she would very much like to make him look like that again. "Walk back with me," she said. "Your horse shouldn't carry weight." "I know," he said, and he took the horse's reins in one hand, and they walked back toward the ranch in the gathering dark, 3 miles through the November grass, and they talked the whole way, not about the future, not about any decision, just about everything and nothing, the way you talk when you are no longer braced and you trust the person beside you with the ordinary contents of your mind. It was the best conversation of Delia Fairchild's life up to that point. She knew it even while it was happening. The next 9 days were a different kind of experience entirely. Something had shifted between them, and they were both aware of it without quite naming it, and the unnamedness gave everything a particular intensity. Every conversation, every shared meal, every morning she arrived at the stable and found him already at work in the yard, and they would look at each other across the distance with a recognition that had grown into something large and bright and slightly alarming. He touched her hand once deliberately when he passed her a cup of coffee in the kitchen, and it was such a simple, ordinary thing, and it stayed with her all day. On the 28th day, Rosalie's letter arrived. Delia had written to her sister regularly, not in great detail, but enough to let her know she was safe and that things were progressing in ways she hadn't anticipated. Rosalie's reply was chatty and affectionate and full of home news. Their father's new barn dog, the first frost in Abilene, the fact that the neighboring Caldwell boy had taken an interest in Rosalie that she was pretending not to encourage. And then at the bottom of the page, in a postscript written in a different ink, as though she'd added it after setting the letter down for a while, Rosalie had written, "Delia, I dared you to write that first letter because I thought it would make you laugh, not because I expected any of this. I hope you know that whatever you decide, whatever you want, your happiness is the only thing that matters. Papa agrees, though he said it with fewer words and more coughing. Come home if you want to come home. Stay if staying is what your heart is asking for. I love you and I'm very proud of you, and I may have started something rather wonderful by accident." Delia set the letter down and looked out the window of her room at Mrs. Holt's boarding house, at the street of Cutter's Creek below, at the mountains beyond the town, at the sky that was enormous up here in a way the Kansas sky never was. She thought about what her heart was asking for, and for once in her life, she let herself answer the question honestly. On the 29th day, Abel came to Mrs. Holt's boarding house at his usual morning hour to collect Delia for the ride to the ranch. He was standing in the doorway, hat in hand in the characteristic nervous gesture she'd come to find endearing, when Delia said, before he could speak, "I'm not going back to Kansas." He went very still. "I want to stay," she said, "if you still want what you said. I want to stay and work here and get to know this land properly," and she paused, because she was not very practiced at this, at saying the vulnerable thing aloud. "And get to know you properly. All of it. Whatever properly looks like." Abel Barnett set his hat on his head. He crossed the few feet between them. He cupped her face in both his large hands very gently, and he looked at her with those dark eyes for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he said, "I have been hoping for 29 days to hear you say that." He kissed her then just once, careful and deliberate, the way he did everything, and it was the kind of kiss that was not an ending but a beginning, the kind that says, "This is where we start." Mrs. Clara Holt, who had been listening from the kitchen with absolutely no shame whatsoever, made a sound of considerable satisfaction and went back to her biscuits. They did not rush anything. That was perhaps the thing that Delia valued most in those months that followed, the absence of any rush. The way Abel understood that building something real required the same patience and consistency he brought to the land itself. They spent the winter getting properly acquainted in the most practical sense. Riding together, working together, spending long evenings in the main house by the fire while the Montana winter came down hard and serious on the valley, reading sometimes, or talking sometimes, or simply occupying the same comfortable space without needing to perform for each other. Delia began training horses for other ranchers in the valley, taking on contracts that came in with increasing frequency as word spread about her ability. Within 2 months of her arrival, she had more work than she could handle alone. Abel helped her set up a proper training area on the ranch property, a round pen, better fencing, a designated section of the large barn for horses under training, and did so with the same matter-of-fact practicality he brought to any rational business proposition, which was what he told her it was when she tried to protest about the expense. He said it was a sound investment in a professional operation that was already demonstrating returns, and he said it with such complete seriousness that she had kissed him on the cheek before she'd thought about doing it, and he had gone slightly pink about the ears in a way that she found incomparably charming. The ranch hands had by now made their peace with her presence in a variety of ways. Cade Sullivan was her staunchest ally, bringing horses to her attention that needed work and defending her professional assessments with the fervor of a convert. Tom Prout, the young hand who had made the dismissive remark in October, had come to her in early December with his hat in his hands and a genuine awkwardness that she found, on consideration, more endearing than the alternative would have been, and he'd apologized in a stilted but sincere way, and she'd accepted it, and after that he'd become one of her harder workers. She wrote to her father in December. Her father, Nathan Fairchild, was a quiet man who expressed emotion largely through silence and occasional gruff monosyllables, and his reply consisted of 4 sentences. "Glad you found a place that suits. Land sounds like good land. Man sounds like a solid man. Your mother would have liked to hear about those mountains." Her mother had died when Delia was 14, which was the year she had turned from a girl who loved horses into a woman who understood them in the bone-deep, inexplicable way that some people are built for a particular thing. She had spent those first terrible months of grief in the stable more than the house, and the horses had been patient with her in a way nothing else had been, and she thought now, reading her father's 4 sentences, that perhaps her mother would have liked to hear about more than just the mountains. She wrote that in her next letter to Abel, not the grief, exactly, but the feeling around it, and he wrote back, in the middle of a long letter about the January cattle inventory, a single paragraph that sat in the middle of the page like a stone in a stream. "I understand that kind of loss, and I understand finding a way to live forward from it rather than away from it. My mother died when I was 17, and she is the reason I build things. She said a man should put something solid in the world. I am trying." Delia folded that letter back along its creases and held it against her chest for a moment before she put it with the others in the box on her desk that was, by January, fairly substantial. Spring came to the Cutter's Creek Valley in a rush that Delia found almost violent after the long, deep winter, everything coming up at once. The grass going brilliantly green, the mountains losing their ice caps from the bottom up, the creek running high and cold and loud. She was outside nearly every daylight hour, and she was happier than she'd been since she couldn't quite remember when, and she knew it. And for once in her life she let herself know it without qualifying it to death. Abel had been increasingly thoughtful in the past few weeks. She'd noticed it without being able to name the exact quality of the change. He wasn't distant. If anything, he was more present, more attentive, more likely to seek her out in the course of a day than he'd been in the winter. But there was something he was carrying, and she didn't push at it, because she trusted him to come to whatever it was in his own time. He came to it on an evening in late April, when they were sitting on the porch of the main house watching the last of the light go over the western ridge. He had his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, and he was looking at the mountains, and she was looking at him, and he said, without preamble, "I would like to ask you to marry me. I've been trying to find the right moment for approximately 6 weeks, and I've come to believe there isn't one, and that I should simply ask." Delia was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you to be less than you are," he said, with a care she recognized as the most important kind. "I'm not asking you to put the horses second or to make a smaller life or to accommodate anyone's idea of what this should look like. I'm asking you to make it ours, your name beside mine on this land, your work and mine building the same thing." He paused. "I love you, Delia. I think I have been falling in love with you since your first letter, if that's not an absurd thing to admit." "It's not absurd," she said softly. "Will you marry me?" She had known the answer for months. She had known it since somewhere in the middle of November, if she was being rigorously honest, which she always was. She turned it over in her mind one last time, not because she doubted it, but because it was the most important thing she would ever say yes to, and she wanted to say it from the most fully conscious and awake part of herself. "Yes," she said. "Abel, yes." He reached over and took her hand and held it in both of his, and they sat like that on the porch while the stars came out one by one over the Montana mountains, and she thought, this is it. This is the thing her life had been building toward without her knowledge, through all the horses and the work and the sharp edges she'd had to grow to survive, and this is where it arrived. They were married in June of 1879 in the small white church at the edge of Cutter's Creek, on a morning when the valley was full of wildflowers and the mountains were so clear and close they seemed to have moved nearer for the occasion. Rosalie came up from Abilene on the train. She had paid for it herself. She announced grandly, with money from selling a quilt, and she was not even a little sorry for starting the whole thing. Their father came too, Nathan Fairchild, quieter than ever and visibly moved by something he would not name, and he shook Abel Barnett's hand for a long moment at the church door and said, "Take care of her." And Abel said, "She'd never allow anything else." And Nathan laughed, a short, surprised sound that Delia hadn't heard from him in years. Mrs. Clara Holt was there, sharp-eyed and satisfied, as though she had personally arranged the whole affair, which Delia rather thought she had in her own oblique way. Cade Sullivan cleaned up so thoroughly that Delia almost didn't recognize him, and he gave a toast at the small wedding supper that was gruff and brief and thoroughly heartfelt. And Tom Prout, who had turned out to be a decent young man once you got past the learning curve, nearly cried into his dinner and pretended he hadn't. The supper was held in the main house of the ranch, which was now formally and legally, and in every meaningful sense Delia's house too. Her name on the deed alongside his Abel had attended to this in advance of the wedding with a thoroughness that she found immensely characteristic. She had walked through the rooms of the house on the morning of the wedding, before going to the church, just once around by herself, touching things and getting used to the shape of this new and permanent belonging, and she had paused in front of the fireplace in the main room where there was a small framed photograph, a portrait of a woman with serious eyes and an old-fashioned collar that she recognized as a portrait of Abel's mother. She had looked at it for a long time. Then she had said very quietly, "I'll look after him, and this place, I promise." She didn't know why she'd done it. She wasn't sure she believed in such things. But it felt right, and Delia Fairchild had learned to trust her instincts. Life on the Barnett ranch in the years that followed was many things, and most of them were exactly what they had imagined, and several of them were entirely different and occasionally more interesting. Delia's horse training operation grew into something that commanded serious attention across 3 counties and into the neighboring territory. She had by 1881 trained horses for 7 different ranches and had begun traveling occasionally to evaluate and assess horses that couldn't be brought to her brief trips of 2 or 3 days, always with a note to Abel describing what she'd found and what she'd done about it, and he always wrote back, even to the town hotel where she was staying, even when she'd be home in 2 days anyway. She thought that was perhaps the most romantic thing about him. The letters had never stopped. He still left notes for her in the morning sometimes, folded and set on the kitchen table beside the coffee pot. They were small things, a line about the weather, an observation he'd made about one of the horses, something she'd said the night before that he'd been thinking about. She kept every one. She had 2 boxes now. Abel expanded the ranch operation in 1880, taking on a contract to provide horses to the United States Army, which had a significant presence in Montana Territory in those years and a constant need for well-trained, reliable stock. The contract was lucrative and demanding, and it was Delia who managed the training side of it, producing horses to the Army's specifications with such consistency and quality that the contracting officer, a skeptical major named Whitfield, had ridden out to the ranch specifically to meet the trainer responsible, and had stood in something resembling speechless awe watching Delia work a string of 4 horses in succession, each one transformed in the space of a morning from uncertain to responsive. Major Whitfield had looked at Abel afterward and said, "Your wife is remarkable." Abel had said, with the particular pride of a man who is not surprised but never stops being pleased, "I am aware." Their first child was born in February of 1881. A boy they named James Nathan Barnett, the middle name for Delia's father, who came up to Montana the following summer to meet his grandson and spent a week on the ranch with the contented air of a man whose worries have been resolved. James Nathan was from the beginning a serious, observant baby who regarded the world with dark eyes exactly like his father's and his mother's cheekbones, and who from the very earliest age displayed an unnerving capacity to simply wait patiently until he got whatever he was after, which Abel found hilarious and Delia found faintly alarming in terms of what it might mean for the future. Rosalie came for the birth and stayed for a month, and was such a cheerful and enthusiastic presence in the house that even Cade Sullivan, who had a generally low opinion of cheerfulness, found himself smiling at the kitchen table more than usual. Rosalie held baby James and told him at length about the circumstances of his parents' meeting, because she felt strongly that this was a story he should grow up knowing, and she told it with considerable creative embellishment that Delia felt obliged to correct at several points. And Abel sat across the kitchen table and watched his wife argue good-naturedly with her sister over the precise nature of a dare, and he thought that this specific, ordinary, irreplaceable moment was the thing he had been building toward all his life without knowing the name of it. He wrote Delia a letter that night, after she'd gone to bed, and he'd sat up finishing some ranch correspondence. Just a short one, 4 lines, set on the kitchen table for her to find in the morning. She found it before sunrise, holding a sleepy James against her shoulder, and she read it by lamplight, and she did not weep this time, she smiled instead, the particular deep and settled smile of a woman who has finally stopped bracing for the ground to shift beneath her feet, because the ground is solid and she knows it. He had written, "I was afraid of you once. I want you to know that now the fear is entirely of a different kind. It is the ordinary terror of a man who has more to lose than he ever expected, and he would not trade it for anything in the world. Thank you for answering that letter." She propped the note against the coffee pot where he would see it when he came down, and on the back of it she had written 2 words, "Thank Rosalie." The years built on each other with the satisfying weight of real things. In 1882, a second child arrived, a girl this time, whom they called Clara after Mrs. Holt, who was so thoroughly undone by this honor that she broke her long-standing policy against public display of emotion and wept openly at the christening, then recovered herself and said it was dust from the road. Clara Barnett was, from birth, the loudest and most opinionated person in any room she occupied, which made Abel feel that the universe had a sense of humor, and made Delia feel she had possibly met her match. Mrs. Holt herself remained a constant presence in their lives. She came to the ranch for Sunday suppers regularly through those years, and she and Delia had developed a friendship that was built on mutual respect and a shared low tolerance for nonsense, and it was one of the most solid relationships in Delia's adult life. The horse training operation had by 1883 grown into a formal business. The Barnett Horse Company, as the sign over the training barn read, painted in clean black letters on whitewashed board, and it employed 2 full-time assistants who worked under Delia's direction, both of them young women she had trained herself. One from Cutter's Creek, and one from a ranch further up the valley, whose father had brought her to Delia at 14, with the observation that the girl could communicate with horses in a way he couldn't account for, and would Delia take her on. She had, and the girl, now 21 and named Patience Hoare, had developed into a genuine talent who was beginning to develop her own methods, which Delia watched and encouraged with the particular pride of a teacher. Delia believed in passing knowledge forward. She believed that a skill kept locked to one person was a skill half-wasted. In the spring of 1883, something happened that tested everything. It began with a legal dispute over water rights. Specifically, the rights to the section of Cutter's Creek that ran through the northern portion of the Barnett Ranch. A man named Garrett Cross had purchased the land bordering Barnett to the north in the fall of 1882, and by the following spring, it had become apparent that Cross's intentions toward the creek were not compatible with Abel's existing usage rights, which were documented and prior, but which Cross was challenging on a technical point of territorial water law that required a hearing before the land commissioner in Helena. It was a serious problem. The creek was essential to the ranch's northern grazing operation and to the water supply for approximately 60 head of cattle that wintered in that section. If Cross won the hearing, the damage to the ranch's operation would be significant. Abel prepared his case with the help of a lawyer in Helena, a methodical man named Fitch who knew territorial water law well. Delia read every document. She sat up late for 3 consecutive nights going through the original land grant, the territorial water regulations, the deeds and the survey maps, and on the 4th morning she came down to breakfast with a look on her face that Abel recognized as the one she wore when she had solved something. She put the survey map on the kitchen table and pointed to a line. "Fitch is arguing the prior appropriation doctrine from the wrong filing date," she said. The original water rights on this property were registered in 1873, 2 years before the territorial amendment that Cross's argument depends on. The amendment doesn't apply retroactively to registrations prior to that date. The entire basis of Cross's challenge fails if you lead with the 1873 filing. Abel looked at the map. He looked at Delia. He said, "How did you figure that out?" "I read the documents," she said, as though this were obvious, which to her it was. "Fitch has been practicing law for 20 years. He's also been working on 3 other cases this month. He may have missed it." She tapped the map again. "Write to him today. Give him the 1873 registration number. Tell him to build the opening argument around it. Abel wrote to Fitch that afternoon. Fitch's reply came back 6 days later, and it was, stripped of its legal language, essentially a man admitting he had missed something obvious and thanking God someone had caught it. He rebuilt the argument. They won the water rights hearing in June. Garrett Cross was not a gracious loser, and there followed a period of several months during which relations with their northern neighbor were strained in ways that ranged from unpleasant to occasionally alarming. A section of fence cut, cattle moved across property lines in circumstances that might have been accident or might not have been. Abel handled it with patient, documented firmness, never escalating beyond what was necessary, and eventually Cross directed his energies elsewhere. The fence stayed intact after that. Delia reflected that living next to a difficult neighbor was not unlike working with a difficult horse. The principles were similar. Document the behavior, don't react emotionally, establish clear boundaries consistently, and wait for the other party to understand that the situation is not going to resolve in their favor. Abel, when she said this, laughed for a full 30 seconds and told her she was the most interesting person he had ever met, and she told him she had a vested interest in keeping it that way. In 1884, Rosalie got married. She had been engaged to a young man named Henry Aldrich, who was a junior partner in an Abilene law firm, and the wedding was held in Abilene in September, and Delia made the trip down with Abel and James, who was 3 years old and had very firm opinions about train travel, and Clara, who was 2 and had firm opinions about everything. Their father Nathan walked Rosalie down the aisle with the same gruff quiet he brought to all significant occasions, and Delia stood next to her sister before the ceremony in the small room off the church and straightened Rosalie's veil and said, "You started all of this, you know." Rosalie beamed. "I know. You're welcome." Delia hugged her sister hard enough that they both had to repin the veil, and neither of them said anything else, because some things are complete without words. Abel spent the evening of the wedding reception talking cattle prices and territorial politics with Henry Aldrich, which was, Delia decided, watching from across the room, a reliable sign that he approved of the man. Abel only engaged in serious conversation with people he took seriously. She had noticed this early and found it to be a consistent rule. The train home to Montana was considerably more peaceful than the one down, because James had apparently exhausted his opinions about train travel and slept the entire way, and Clara spent the journey fascinated by the window, pressing her small nose to the glass and narrating what she saw in a continuous, incomprehensible stream of 2-year-old commentary that Abel translated for Delia's benefit with a patient seriousness that made Delia love him so acutely she had to look out the opposite window for a moment. Back on the ranch, life continued its particular rhythm of the physical and the intellectual, the daily work of the land and the animals, the evening conversations that ranged from the immediate and practical to the philosophical, the letters that still moved between them whenever the distance of a day's separate work required it. In the winter of 1884, Abel began teaching James to ride, beginning exactly as Delia had suggested, with patience and consistency from the left side, earning the horse's trust before asking for anything, and the boy took to it with the focused, waiting patience that characterized everything he approached. Cade Sullivan retired from his position as ranch foreman in the spring of 1885, at the age of 63, and moved into town to live with his daughter, and there was a supper in his honor at the ranch house that lasted until well past midnight, and Cade made a speech that was mostly complaints about the various ways the ranch had been difficult over the years, delivered with such transparent affection that everyone was laughing and several people were crying simultaneously. He shook Abel's hand. He hugged Delia briefly and with great dignity, and he said very quietly in her ear, "You're the best thing that happened to this place." And she said, "We both know that's not entirely true," and he said, "Let me be wrong in peace," which was, she decided, the most Cade Sullivan thing he had ever said. His replacement as foreman was a man named Reed Calloway, 29 years old, a former Army horse wrangler who had heard about the Barnett operation through the military contracting network and had ridden into Cutter's Creek in February looking for work. Delia had assessed him in the first 10 minutes of conversation and told Abel that afternoon he was capable and honest, and that the Army had trained him well and that she thought he'd do. Abel had hired him the following morning, and Reed had proven her assessment accurate in every particular. By 1886, James Barnett was 5 years old and could read had been reading since 4, with an appetite that delighted both his parents and regularly surprised visitors who were not expecting a small child to have opinions about the material he'd been given. Delia had taught him herself, the way her own mother had taught her, with a seriousness that communicated clearly that reading was not a courtesy skill but a fundamental one, and James absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, completely, methodically, and then immediately looking for what came next. Clara was 4 and could ride under supervision better than many adults, and had already demonstrated that her mother's way with horses was apparently heritable. She had an additional quality her mother lacked, which was a complete absence of physical fear. She simply did not appear to experience it, which was something Delia found herself watching with a combination of pride and carefully contained alarm. Abel watched his children with the same patient attentiveness he brought to the land and the animals and the woman he had married, and sometimes in the evenings when the house was quiet, and both children were in bed and Delia was reading at the kitchen table, and the lamp was throwing its warm light across everything, he would look up from whatever he was doing and feel the particular gratitude of a man who knows exactly what he has and why it matters. He had written her a letter on their 5th anniversary, June of 1884, that she had read 3 times and then put carefully in the larger of the 2 boxes, near the top. He had written about the first letter she'd sent him, the deliberately challenging one with its blunt declaration of who and what she was. He said that letter had told him more in its first paragraph than most people could convey in an entire conversation, and what it had told him was that she was a person who would never pretend to be less than she was for anyone's comfort, and that this was the rarest quality he had ever encountered and the one he valued most in the world. He said that every day on this ranch was a different argument for the proposition that the best things in life were arrived at by honest means, and that she was the most honest thing in his life, and that he loved her with a depth and a certainty that he suspected would simply continue to grow for as long as either of them was breathing. She had written back on their anniversary evening a letter of her own, not a short note but a full letter, the kind they used to write across the miles, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp and the quiet house around her. She had written that she had come to Cutter's Creek, expecting to find out whether a man she'd met in correspondence was real, and what she had found instead was herself. The version of herself she'd always suspected existed, but hadn't had the right conditions to become. She wrote that he had never once tried to make her smaller, and that she had spent enough of her life among people who found her inconvenient and capable too much at once to know how extraordinary that was. She wrote that loving him was the most confident thing she'd ever done. She'd left that letter on the kitchen table for him, and he had come down early the next morning and read it standing in his socks by the stove, and she had watched him from the doorway without saying anything, and when he finished reading it, he had set it down very carefully, as though it was breakable, and he had turned and looked at her across the kitchen with those dark eyes in the early morning light, and neither of them had said a word for a full minute, and that had been enough. In 1887, Delia's father, Nathan Fairchild, died quietly in the night in Abilene, at the age of 67, of the kind of heart failure that the doctor said had probably been coming a long time. Rosalie wrote the letter, and it arrived on a Wednesday, and Delia read it at the kitchen table and then went outside and walked to the stable and stood with Brigadier, who was 12 years old now and as settled and magnificent as any horse on the ranch, and she pressed her forehead against his neck and wept in the way she rarely wept, openly and without managing it. Abel found her there. He didn't speak. He put his hand between her shoulder blades and kept it there, warm and steady, and she leaned back against it, and he held her up for as long as she needed it. She went to Abilene for the funeral, taking James but leaving Clara, who was too young for the trip and who stayed with Mrs. Holt, who had taken on a grandmotherly role toward both Barnett children with a thoroughness that no one had requested and everyone appreciated. Abel stayed on the ranch, but wrote her every day she was gone short letters. Nothing elaborate, just the news of the ranch and the children and small observations. And she wrote back from Rosalie's house in the evenings, and the letters crossed in the mail the way they had in the beginning, back and forth across the distance. She had brought the first box of letters with her, not the second, not the notes, just the original correspondence, the ones that had built everything. She wasn't sure why she'd brought them. She read through them again on the train home, watching the plains flatten out below her, and then the mountains begin to reassemble themselves on the horizon as she moved back toward Montana. She read them in order, from the beginning, and she thought about the woman who had written the first letter on a dare and hadn't expected anything, and she thought about the man who had answered it with his complete attention and an honesty she'd spent years believing wasn't available to her. She thought about her father's 4 sentences, "Glad you found a place that suits." She thought that was perhaps the most perfectly worded assessment of everything she'd found in Montana. She was met at the station in the evening by Abel, who had driven the wagon in himself rather than send a hand, and he was standing beside the wagon with his hat in his hands in the old familiar gesture, and she climbed down from the stage and walked to him, and he wrapped both arms around her in the straightforward way he had, no performance in it, just his arms and his warmth and his solid, reliable presence. "Welcome home," he said, against her hair. She held on to him for a moment. "Thank you for the letters," she said. "Always," he said, and she knew he meant it exactly. James Barnett grew up to be a serious, principled man who went to the university at Missoula when it opened and studied law, which surprised no one who had watched him as a child, moving steadily and methodically toward whatever he was after. He came home to practice in Helena eventually, and he had his father's face and his mother's mind, and a quality of fairness that both his parents recognized as something he'd built himself from the materials of his own character, which is the best kind. Clara Barnett became a horse trainer. This surprised even fewer people. She trained horses in the valley until she married a rancher from across the mountains named Sam Whitaker, and she trained horses in her new valley after that. And the 2 operations, hers and her mother's, developed a working relationship that was characterized by occasional fierce professional disagreement and total mutual respect, which was about what everyone had expected. By 1890, the Barnett Ranch covered over 1,200 acres, and the horse operation was one of the most reputable in Montana Territory, which became Montana State in November of 1889, a change that Abel marked by saying very little and looking at the mountains for a while, and Delia marked by writing about it in a letter to Rosalie, and then thinking that it was strange and beautiful to see the place you'd made your life become something official on a map of the country. Mrs. Clara Holt died in the spring of 1891, at 73 years of age, in her own bedroom at the boarding house, with her daughter from Billings at her bedside. Delia and Abel attended the service with James and Clara, and Delia stood at the graveside and thought about the evening. Mrs. Holt had said she wanted to be loved without being managed. She thought that was a complete and sufficient description of what she had found, and she thought that Clara Holt had known it before she had, and that this was perhaps the most important service anyone had ever done her. There was a 4th child eventually, another boy, born in 1892, whom they named William after no one in particular, just because they liked it. William arrived in the world with a temperament that was entirely his own, which was to say, cheerful, impractical, and perpetually in pursuit of whatever thing was most interesting rather than most useful. And he drove his mother to distraction, and his father to laughter on a regular basis. And he was, in the way of youngest children who do exactly as they please, deeply and thoroughly adored. Abel wrote William a letter on the occasion of his 5th birthday, because Abel's instinct about everything important was to write it down, and the letter said that his father hoped William would grow up to be exactly as himself as possible, and that this ranch and this family had been built by people who refused to be less than what they were, and that this was the inheritance he was leaving him, alongside the land. Delia read the letter before Abel sealed it, because he always showed her what he wrote to the children. He said he wanted her eyes on it, that she caught things he missed, that her judgment was the one he trusted most. She read it through and then handed it back and said, "It's perfect. Don't change a word." He sealed it and gave it to William, who looked at the envelope with curiosity and said, "Is it Christmas?" And Delia said, "No," and Abel said, "It's better," and William turned the envelope over several times and then tucked it carefully into the pocket of his shirt, which was the most careful thing he'd done in recent memory. And both his parents noticed it and looked at each other over his head with the particular wordless communication of two people who have known each other long enough to hold entire conversations in a glance. The ranch in 1895 was a different kind of place than the one Delia had arrived at in October of 1878, larger, more established, the buildings solid and well-maintained, the operation running with the smoothness of something that has been built and tended and thought about for a long time. There were photographs now on the walls of the main house, the kind that required a proper photographer and a trip to Helena, which they made every few years, and in the most recent one, taken in 1894, you could see 4 people standing in front of the ranch house in their best clothes. Abel, who was 46 now and had the look of a man who had arrived at his life with satisfaction, and Delia, who was 44 and had not softened or diminished in any direction, but had somehow become more entirely herself with each passing year, and James, who was 13 and solemn, and Clara, who was 12 and trying not to squint into the sun and failing, and William, who was 2 and had declined to stand still, and was therefore a slight blur on the left-hand side. Delia sometimes stood in front of that photograph in the early morning while the house was quiet and studied it the way she studied everything important, the way you study something you want to understand all the way down, not just the surface of it. She looked at the woman in the photograph and thought about the woman who had written a letter on a dare, blunt and challenging, and braced against disappointment before it even arrived. She thought about the man who had answered with his complete attention. She thought about the letters, the long ones and the short ones and the notes, and the 4 pages Abel had written after Brigadier first stood quiet, the pages that had made her weep at her desk in Abilene by lamplight, the pages that had told her she was extraordinary by a man who did not use that word loosely. She heard his step behind her. She always heard it. She knew the exact sound of it, and he stopped beside her and looked at the photograph with her. "We look like people who know what they're doing," he said. "We do," she agreed. "Most of the time." He put his arm around her shoulders, which was the gesture of 20 years of mornings, easy and complete and still to her, the most comfortable place she'd ever been. "I was thinking," he said, "about writing James a letter. He asked me last week about how the ranch started and I gave him the short version, but I think the long version is better, the part about your first letter." Delia was quiet for a moment. "Tell him about the dare," she said. Abel looked at her with something that still, after all this time, arrived in his eyes with the quality of a man who is not entirely accustomed to his own luck. All of it," she said. "That it was a dare and that I wrote it expecting nothing and that what I got was," she paused, "because there were some things that resisted easy description and this was one of them. Tell him what I got was everything, and that it started with a letter, and that he should never underestimate the power of saying exactly who you are to the right person. Abel looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll write it tonight." She nodded. She turned back to the photograph, and the morning light came through the window and lay across the wooden floor in long, warm stripes. And somewhere in the house, William was beginning to make the particular brand of early morning noise that indicated he was awake and had a plan. And outside in the stable she could hear the horses moving in their stalls, and the mountains were doing what they always did in the morning, standing there, enormous and clear and simply present, the way some things that are permanent manage to be. She thought about the letter she would write to Rosalie this week. She thought she would tell her sister something she should have said years ago and had always implied but never quite stated directly. She would tell her that the dare had been the bravest thing Rosalie had ever done on her behalf, and that she owed her an enormous debt, and that she was planning to spend the rest of her life considering herself adequately paid by virtue of being exactly where she was. She went and found paper and sat down at the desk that was still by the window, the same desk where she'd first read Abel's letters in this house, all those years ago, and she picked up her pen. Abel came and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her settle in the way he'd watched her settle into this house and this life, not anxiously, the way you watch something uncertain, but with the deep and restful attention of a man who is looking at something he loves completely and knows it. He said, quietly, "Coffee's on." She said, without looking up from the page, "I know. I'll be there in a moment." He went back to the kitchen, and she heard him moving around in there, the ordinary domestic sounds of a morning in the house they had built together, and she smiled over her letter to Rosalie, and she wrote the first line. She wrote, "Dear Rosalie, I owe you an apology, a confession, and a thank you in that order. The apology is that I have never properly told you what that dare became. The confession is that I knew within the first month that I was going to stay, and I was afraid to say it even to myself. The thank you is for everything else, for the dare and the letter, and the particular brand of impractical courage that has always been the most useful thing about you. I am sitting at my desk in Montana on a November morning in 1895, and I am more fully myself than I have ever been, and I am loved in exactly the way I always suspected I needed to be and never quite believed was possible. You started it. You should know that." She paused and looked out the window at the mountains and felt the particular completeness of a life that has found its right shape. Then she wrote, "Also, William has apparently taught the barn cat to open the kitchen door, which is Abel's problem to solve, not mine. Come visit soon. Bring Henry. The children miss their aunt." She finished the letter and sealed it and set it with the rest of the outgoing mail, and she went to the kitchen where Abel had poured her coffee, and William was explaining to his father at great volume, and somewhat implausible length exactly, why the barn cat should be allowed in the house, and she sat down at the table in the morning light and listened to both of them, and she thought that this ordinary, irreplaceable morning, with the mountains outside and the coffee and the noise, and the man across the table who still left her notes by the coffee pot sometimes, and the letters in the 2 boxes upstairs, and the whole beautiful weight of a life honestly lived, this was exactly what she had wept for, reading his words in the lamplight in Abilene, without knowing yet exactly what she was weeping for. She had known, even then. She had known it was this.